Disclaimer: the information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GANS processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. And yes, this is the Cash American Knowledge Team meeting of 2025, and we are all part of it. And that's one of the beauties of the Cash Foundation, because in a sense, what we're talking about is activating the grassroots level. And we are the grassroots. And the reason for that, of course, is because this planet needs us. And that's something that is part of the awakening for most people. We have this craving to be needed, and we've always been needed. It's never something that we've lost. So please join us on this trip as we embark on a new series. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. We are discussing the intermediate GANS technology now. We're introducing a subject called Transaction Zone. My name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It's October 19th of 2025, and this is part of the Keshe Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So as we've been trying to distill all the information into bite-sized pieces, we find that we have an extremely large number of bite-sized pieces because we've been doing this for many years. And here is a schedule of what we have so far accomplished to the end of last week, where we finished the basic GANS Tech series, where we're discussing GANS as a popcorn, its polyatomic nature, the direction of flow, the epitome of love as it's manifest in the GANS affinity, and of course the GANS matter. And this is all designed to allow you to have a different perspective on ways and means that you can teach, because each of you is individual in terms of your knowledge and your ability to present, and you must work towards your strength so that you can help your neighbors or those you connect with to follow through with the new technology. And we are trying to move ahead. And so we are going to discuss the transaction zone today. And what is the transaction zone? Because this is a new phrase. It's trying to figure out what is the best way to describe the inertia field. And we know that a transaction zone can be A store can be a restaurant, can be a bank, can be the stock market. But in the plasma science, the transaction zone manifests itself into an inertia field. And so, what does all of that encompass in this phrase? So, what we've been trying to do is to bring together the teachings of Marian Kesh, as we see in book number 1, the universal order of the creation of matter. And so, this is a transaction zone where we're bringing the matter, the dark matter, and the antimatter together. And so we have a manifestation of one field. And then we have the structure of light as outlined in the book number 2, where we have the go between two matter fields. That go between is also a transaction zone. And then, of course, book number 3, the origin of the universe, we see another kind of transaction zone where we have the one field breaking up into the sister universe and man's universe. And so that breakup becomes a transaction zone. But our small scheme is centered around man's universe. And within that scheme is planet Earth. And it's a tiny little speck in man's universe. And we are on that speck. So we are a speck on a speck. And that speck is our transaction zone. So for 400 weeks, Rick Crammond and the Universal Council have bringing forth the concept of one planet, one nation, one race for justice and world peace. And if you look at what it means, is that we seem to discriminate by skin color, or we discriminate by country of origin, but we are all from the one planet, Earth. That's the one planet. And so what happens when we engage other planets? Who will discriminate who? Isn't that an interesting question? Because if we're discriminating amongst ourselves, then what are the limitations of this discrimination? And if we are discriminating each other, and remember that both sides have to discriminate, then what's going to happen with the universal community? Are they going to discriminate against us? And we don't often ask that question, let alone get an answer for that question, because we're not understanding the true nature of the plasma science. So we are used to the higher strength eating the weaker strength, but the plasma rule is that the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. And so wherever it feeds, it becomes that binding zone. But when you bring these two fields together in terms of our self-serving needs, we see that as a point of conflict. And in reality, it's part of the manifestation of the inertia field. And since we come together into a weaker state, that weaker state is of a lower energy state. But to compensate, it becomes more dense. So that becomes an inertia density manifestation. So what we're going to suggest here is, because we could construe it as a binding zone, or we can construe it as a conflict point. But how about we just call it a transaction zone? And then whether you want to have conflict there or you want to do a binding, it's it's entirely your choice. And feel free to make that choice. But remember, your choice has consequences. So this is the issue that we're facing, because we all need our energy binding for self-serving purposes. That's our current dimension point. But if we are doing it at the expense of others who actually have the same issue, then we are diminishing their dimension point strength. And in fact, we are robbing them and cheating them. And the problem with this really extends to the fact that we have opportunities to draw energy from other places that are far more, shall we say, lucrative or far more energetic. And so we seem to settle always for the lowest common denominator. And we learned that in basic mathematics in public school. And why are we always settling for the lowest common denominator? Can't we settle for a higher common denominator? Why do we always have to go to the bottom? Why are we always scraping the bottom? Oh, well, it could have something to do with terracing. And terracing is where you have a connection by gravity. That's right. We are focused on gravity. And if you take one pond and you have another pond or a body of water, and you want to connect the two bodies of water, the water will flow from the upper to the lower, and we call that a falling gradient. That falling gradient is actually a transaction zone. And what we don't see is the exchange of energy that is coming from the upper field or pond to the lower field or pond. We just see it as a connection by gravity. But interestingly enough, if you've ever had to do siphoning with a hose, you will find that you have to initiate this falling with an external force. And that once you create this connection by gravity, you no longer have to input that external force. The falling gradient just continues because the component of the connection is all the way through from start to finish. And so if you have a motion that is facilitating this connection, then you have to make space. So in other words, the water has to come out at the bottom to allow the water to come in at the top. And so the connection, be it by a waterfall or be it by a siphon hose, is the transaction zone. And so let's discuss in greater detail what that means. Because when we talk about this falling thing, it's a falling towards increased density. And we fall at many, many different angles. So it's an angular density, and it gives us an increased pressure. We translate that as increased gravity. But fundamentally, in terms of our social structure, we have an increased dependence on Earth space feeding. And we didn't say what kind of feeding, but there's this pressure, and it's an internal, like a popcorn pressure, where it wants to expand the GANS and the tensity of the GANS. And so we get to be categorized as fallen angels. But since angular momentum is conserved, we never ask, where did we fall from? And why did we fall? And why did we fall here? And those are just some of the questions, not all of the questions. But the thing is, when we look at the social dilemma that we face, it's actually a louche dilemma. And so many of us practice louche harvesting, which is the personal energy and vitality of your existence. And so some people have this single-minded intention. They like your honey and they want to steal your honey. And others who see this as a, shall we say, a progression on your part. Why make something and build something when you can steal it from someone else? And then, of course, there's a apparent benefit. You maybe make more money, or you maybe acquire more power and influence. And so other people see this. And so this translates into what we call a hive mind. intention. And this gets embedded within you. And since we are basically bags of GANS, as we've discussed before, this is a representation of our GANS intention. And so where is this limitation, and why are we in this dilemma? So we have to understand that it is affecting our vitality. And so all of us are seeking an emotional and physical revitalization, if you will. And years ago, when we were younger, we just assumed that when you get old, you become decrepit. But we find that age is not the determining factor. What is more important, are you a louche leaker? In other words, are you leaking your own vitality by giving your time and attention to things that don't matter? And when we're looking at vitality, it's bad enough that we're working from a deficient point of view. But if in addition to that we are leaking, that's a double jeopardy. So with the KAKT Foundation, what we've discovered is that there are many commandments, and they seem to pertain only to the humanity species. The dogs and cats don't seem to have any commandments, and yet they seem to be well organized, and when treated properly, they are very, very friendly. But they have the same lack in terms of nutrition and food, and so they wish to eat, and it's very important to be truthful to a dog or a cat, because it's hard to explain to them, well, we don't have any food today, so you're going to have to go hungry. And so it's a wonder how they're going to react to that particular thing, because they can't communicate with you in terms of words. They can only communicate with you in other ways. And we all know about the love and affection that a pet can give you. So it's very important that thou shalt not lie. And the reason for it is because if you want peace and harmony with your pet, you better be truthful. But we are more truthful with our pets than we are with other humans. And it's a wonder why we have this lack of compassion for other humans. And it becomes part of our hive intention. So we find that poker is a game that can be played on Earth because we have this self-serving attitude. But there's no poker playing in outer space, because the game of poker is a physical game. And so truth seekers have a dilemma, because they have an accountability to themselves. But when they see a liar, and poker players are excellent liars and deceivers, do we accuse them, or do we shield ourselves from them? But in this dilemma, liars have a dilemma as well, because they have an accountability to their soul. And the question for them is, do they quit lying or suffer the consequences? Because the truthfulness of the GANS is that there are consequences. So they may be delayed, but they're still there. And the reason they may be delayed is because we're not operating on the transmutation highway. We're operating on the transmission highway, which is the lowest carbon 12 highway. There's an intermediate transition highway, the carbon 14 highway. The transmutation highway, which is what we're striving for as part of the Spaceship Institute, is to get to the carbon 16 highway. And each of these positions is a transaction zone. So when we're talking about these different energy levels, we are talking about energy zones. And as such, they are uniquely different in terms of shall we say, vitality. And so we discovered that when we made the cups of life, because we incorporated the nanocoding process of the monatomic science to create the GANS. And the GANS was a reflection of our inner space that was also showing the emotional strength that we were having. That emotional strength can manifest in our emotions, but also in our physicality. And we had two cups. And as a result of those two cups, each one being a transaction zone, we created different GANS radiation manifestations. So we had the CO2, the calcium, zinc, copper, water, and amino acid GANS. And now we've graduated to the production of gold GANS, among other things. And we're having trouble in this public teaching to keep up with the advancements because now they're accelerating and they're moving a lot faster than what we're used to on a physical plane. And it just goes to show you that if you want to keep up, you're either going to have to work harder or you're going to have to work smarter. And of course, if we understand the cup of the universe, that's where the smarts come from, because we have a bicameral mind with two hemispheres, and we see how they come together with the emotional zinc and the physical copper GANS, and then, of course, the connection to the carbogen, which is a connection to the universe. So you have these three fields, and they come together. And so the mind becomes this transaction zone, but the mind is incapable on its own of doing much in the physicality other than sit there like a blob. And so, of course, now we have to have an interaction with a place, and that place is our Earth space. And so the Earth space is also a transaction zone, and our connection to that Earth space is the inertia field of cup number 4. And cup number 4 is the transaction zone. So in order for us to manifest our universal GANS, we have to have a place. And then the interaction of those two is that transaction zone, which we, in simple terms, call life. And that attribute only extends to what we see in physicality. But when we look at the susceptibility of the GANS, and we say, well, something is something, nothing is nothing. So therefore, something is always something as opposed to being something else. Well, how does that happen? And so when we look at the GANS in its singular nature, and on the picture on the left, we're looking at the top of a cup, and we already start to see this transaction zone in the bottom, where we start to see a rotating field. And in the right, we can actually see that this rotating field manifests into a hole where there is no GANS, but there is water. But there's water all around, and that water is contained in a glass. And we can see through that glass, we can see through the water, and we can see through that hole. And each of these is a transaction zone. So collectively, at the core of what we're looking at is the transaction zone of the hole in the GANS. So is that susceptibility in singularity? In other words, when we're looking at a star formation, as we did originally with the rotating balls, we found that each one created a field, and each one had a field strength, and it was changeable. And that changeability was not visible. So we just attributed the changeability to each individual rotating field. But what we now know is that it's actually a susceptibility in duality, where we actually create a dynamic plasma field, which is a combination of all of these fields. And so we say duality, and well, how do you have it when you have four rotating balls coming together in a star formation? Well, the thing is that the transaction zone in between is an amalgamation of the duality between each ball and the focal point of the star formation. So what you have is a susceptibility in duality because you have four dualities here with all 4 points of the star formation. And of course, we understand that three of the star formation are part of the gravitational forces, and the singular at the top is the magnetical. And so we now have a direction of flow. So when we're talking about destruction, when we're talking about self-serving needs at the expense of others, the generic question is, when two forces come together, is it destruction or is it creation? So just like we say, well, nothing is nothing, something is always something, as opposed to being something else. So destruction is a kind of creation. The question you have to ask is, what kind of creation are you creating? Because whether you feel as if you have control or whether you don't, it's something that you are creating. And this is the revelation that we all have to come, because we have the fundamental bringing together of two forces. And so, which forces and how do they come together and where do they come together? And so we look at the coming together as a susceptibility in the singularity, right? So the transaction zone is in this singularity. But when we look at how these forces come together, we find that we create the basics of the X and Y axis. And we say, okay, well, there's a manifestation of a singularity. And this is coming from what we call PM ticks, which they themselves were in singularity. So they come together and they create this one force. And then that manifests into a complete three-dimensional form. And of course, in order to maintain that form, because energy is always in motion, we have to give it a track so that the energy can keep going without it leaving its containment. But these forces have come together. And so now they're in the containment. Does that mean more forces have stopped coming in? Have we come to the end of that? Or are they still coming in? Just like that siphon hose. Well, if they are going to continue to come in, and now that you've created this containment of a transaction zone, that means energy has to flow out. And so this is what we discovered with the nano alignment. We had a copper wire and we put a nano coating on it, but it was a carbon nanocrystal. And we had many, many layers, and they were coming together, and they created a magnetical orientation and a gravitational inertia point in the core. And then through that field alignment, we had a direction of flow. So that was part of the nanotech series, and it followed the conservation of inertia rules, where we have a MAGRAV energy transfer state. That MAGRAV is a magnetical gravitational relationship. So that there's two sides to that relationship to create that singularity, but there's two sides of the equation. So you have the singularity on one side and the singularity on the other side, and then you create that equal sign that gives you this convergence susceptibility. And of course, you have these turning points where you can go from GANS to GANS, or you can go from GANS to nanostate, or you can go from atomic state right up to the GANS state. And these are all done in terms of physicality, or in terms of what we call matter state. So the GANS had a unique characteristic because it was like a popcorn. And instead of having one point, it had many, many points. And each one of these points is a negative charge. And so they all emanate from the gravitational positive charge at the center. And since GANS is a gas as a nanosolid, then the gas was in the center. And of course, we all know the gas wants to explode, or gas wants to expand, excuse me. So we had a GANS explosion. And this is much bigger, and we can see that with the naked eye. We could not see the nanocoating with the naked eye until we achieved the 30 to 40,000 layers. But in its singularity, we could never see it. We would need a special microscope to be able to see it. So now we can see the physicality of the GANS, and we say, well, how does that affect our Earth matter? Because the Earth is part of this manifestation of physicality of the inertia towards density. And so the question then is this transacted in singularity or duality? Because we only have the one Earth. So we could say that the Earth is in singularity, but there are many types of GANSes, and the Earth is a composite of all of these different GANSes. So when we ask that question, is it in singularity or is it duality? We have to say that it's in duality, but we didn't say which duality, because there is an interaction with each and every GANS, and each and every interaction is a transaction zone. Because there is a susceptibility. And that susceptibility comes into play when you take a look at the environment. Who are the neighbors? What is the field strength? And then we find that, wait a second, as part of this nuclear feeding inertia, we find that the Earth space is a complexity, but each of the GANSes are a fragment of that complexity, and each of the GANSes have a gravitational stability. But each of the GANSes can exchange energy, so they give us this dimensional portability. So they can go through various dimension points. And all of these points, as we said in the cup, universal cup, 1 plus 1 plus 1 is more than 3, because you end up with the product, but the 1 plus 1 is not destroyed. It continues to be there. So you still have those, and that's a neat transaction. It's like buying a car and you pay money for it, but you get to keep the money and you keep the car. Well, that's not the way our society works, is it? That's just wishful thinking. But the Earth space does work that way, because all the periodic table uh, of elements are collective with respect to this Earth space. So not only do we have all the elements, but we also have the energy that manifested these elements. And so each of these elements, in fact, becomes a transaction zone. So what we have to understand is that when we are mining and we see ourselves as being able to dig, shall we say, into the crust of the earth and come up with a mineral, we acquire it by taking it from the earth. But the earth acquired it as a product of the transaction zone. So why are we working so hard to steal it from the earth? Why don't we just incorporate the methodology that the earth uses? Because it seems to use a whole lot less energy to manifest all of these elements. than we are, because we need big trucks and cranes and backhoes and pickaxes and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. But I digress. What we have to incorporate now with the intermediate GANS tech is to understand this rolling singularity, because as part of the x-axis transmission, we see that we're moving perpendicular to the ground, and the rotation of the wheels of our cars, if you will, are perpendicular to the motion. So the output motion is aligned with the rotation. So now we have an impetus to create a movement on the x-axis dimension. But if we are on a slight incline, now we have a different kind of rolling. It's towards density. So this is part of the y-axis transmission. So we have two types of rolling, one along the x-axis dimension and one along the y-axis dimension. The rolling becomes the transaction zone. Where are you going? Well, wherever you're going is where you're not now. And when you get there, you'll be there. And where you are now, you won't be there. How did you get there? So there has to be some kind of energy transaction that allows you to go from here to there. And it has to take into account the x-axis transmission and the y-axis density transmission, because not all roads are flat. So however you go is that transaction zone. And what's important to understand that when we look at this motion, it is between two fields, right? So either it's on the flat, or it's on a slope going down, or it's on a slope going up. But the thing is that this transaction zone is not just identifying you here and there, but it also, shall we say, when we do racing, we determine the distance by time. We say, well, the travel from the first point to the second point, shall we say, takes 5 seconds. Well, how far do you go in those 5 seconds? Well, I guess it depends on the speed, doesn't it? So this is the concept that we want to talk about when we're talking about this motion. And we can see this clearly in GANS motion. And I've talked about this many times in the past. The GANS motion maintains a point in the water, and the water, of course, changes its density. So when you look at a beaker full of water, and it's full of GANS that is floating in that water, some of the GANS rises and some of the GANS falls. And some of the GANS keeps moving. A lot of the GANS settles to the bottom eventually. So what we have to understand, since the GANS can give and take and exchange energy in that give and take, so we understand that when we go to a lower density, that is magnetical, and that has a negative charge. And when we go to a higher density, that is gravitational, and it has a positive charge. In order to move, it has to give and then take. So it seems that we can only give in the magnetical direction, if that's the only direction. But we know that we can roll down a hill. But when we look at the GANS, some of the GANS wants to come up. And so if we look at the various levels in the water and just say those are different levels of density in the beaker, then to move from one level of density to another level of density, before you move, you have to give, and you give a negative charge. And then you have to take. Taking is a positive charge. So what you have to do is either give and take through attraction, or you give and take through repulsion. Either way, you're creating a motion. And so that becomes a gradient transition. And the steepness identifies the transition gradient. The greater the steepness, the faster the motion. But you have to give and take energy in the direction that you're flowing in. And the determination of the direction of flow, of course, is the relationship between the magnetical and gravitational field forces as it pertains to the environment. So that is the basis of the GANS motion. So the transaction zone could be like a racetrack around. And so it could be like the PM ticks coming together. And so you say, well, the motion along this racetrack in the rotating field is a field capture in its singularity, because you have the car and it moves to another position. You're still in that same car. So it's one and the same. So it's in singularity. But when you look at the energy exchange, then, and you see the dynamic plasma, which doesn't have this physicality, but it creates this zone. So you could say, well, I have this field capture and it's in singularity. That's the basis of the plasma. But look at this diatomic hydrogen. We have a relationship between two molecules, and it has a covalent bond. So in order to determine this hydrogen, we have to see, are the poles alike or are the poles opposite to each other? And so that's the difference between being orthohydrogen and parahydrogen. But we still have that covalent bond. And so each part of these two hydrogens is a transaction zone, and the bond itself becomes a transaction zone between these two transaction zones. But clearly, we can see that not all transaction zones are alike, despite the fact that the original fields are identical. But something has happened to flip one of the poles. And it's not obvious because each one of these fields is a hydrogen. So why does one have two like poles and one have two opposite poles facing each other? And then that becomes the connection to the source. And how this is oriented is part of the field connection that we see manifest in carbon-14. And that's in a field that's near and dear to us here. But what's even farther, but still dearer, is our connection to the universe. And so we see the manifestation of the carbon-60. But that's not the end. There's still the unicos and the creator himself, and more is going on. So can we say that the transaction zone is actually a field capture in singularity twice? So the red car moving from one point to the other point has a transaction zone to describe that movement. Well, the white car going from one point to another car has a transaction zone to reflect its movement. So each transaction zone is in its singularity, but within this field or track, we have two singularities. Is there a relationship between the two? Well, there better be, otherwise there's going to be one big crack up. So what does it mean when we have a dynamic plasma that represents a field capture in singularity? And we have an inertia field capture in two singularities. So now we have a different kind of transaction zone. So kind of like the example we used with the hydrogen, you have these interacting spheres, but you have a connection with the North Pole to the South Pole and the South Pole to the North Pole. And that polar point of view becomes a MAGRAV energy transfer state because the energy is going in two directions. And it is, in this case, only from a polar point of view. But if we understand that the conservation of energy requires a balance from one side and a balance on the other side, then the mass point of view becomes a transaction zone between the two poles. So in other words, there's a polar exchange and there's a MAGRAV energy transfer to maintain each one. And this would be between the two spheres. So if we look at the radiance pole flipping, we see one pole is the feeding radiance and one pole is the feedback radiance. But as we found that through the vertical emission, the energy goes around the gravitational plasma in the core. And so in the emission, it's a magnetical plasma. But it moves. It moves. And in order to move, it has to be attracted to something. And so we have another magnetical plasma, which is gravitational. So the movement of the one magnetical plasma to the other position of that magnetical plasma is a transaction zone in its singularity. And then to move from that point to another point is another transaction zone in its singularity. So it keeps going. But it's not just one plasma going around. As you can see, there are many fields going around, many plasmas, many emissions, and many PM ticks. And then to understand where this energy comes to do this movement, we have to understand that there's a cosmic ray feeding. So the energy is coming in. But if it comes in on the magnetical side to offset it and keep it in balance, it has to come on the gravitational side as well. And in order to travel, then when we look at the travel through inner space, we find that we have a plasma core vacuum and we have a vacuum outside. And we look at our physicality and we say, well, we don't have a vacuum on the outside. Yes, but we're inside Earth space. But Earth space does have a vacuum on the outside. So we're in between the vacuum of the area beyond the magnetosphere and the vacuum in the core. And we can move around on this planet, but we don't follow flux lines like these plasma rays do. We move in terms of our physicality. But this magnetical plasma seems to move by using a transaction zone to go from one point to another point. So if we look at where this cosmic ray feeding is coming in, then it can come as a cosmic ray, or it can come as another plasma field. So if you look carefully, you can see that there's a plasma field in some nebulous point, and the interaction of that with magnetical field creates a transaction zone. And if we have a motion, it's not necessary to have a transaction zone between the first. It could be a transaction zone with another. And so the manifestation point of that transaction creates one magnetical field, and the manifestation of the other one creates another magnetical field in a different position. And so the motion of these magnetical fields also is a transaction zone. So looking on the right side of the picture, we have a transaction zone with another plasma field and a second plasma field. And the energy transaction between the inertia fields is another transaction zone, which facilitates the motion. And that motion goes around a track, which is governed by the interaction with the gravitational core. So the maintenance of the gravitational core is a transaction zone because it is stable gravitationally by having a magnetical and a gravitational field force facilitating that stability. And in order to create this magnetical field, there has to be a relationship between the gravitational core and the magnetical field. But since that magnetical field is moving, then when we look at the first position, there is a transaction zone between the gravitational core and the magnetical field. And the second point also has a relationship between the gravitational zone and the magnetical zone. And so that too affects the motion. So in other words, just a simple motion of the vertical emission of the magnetical force field to move around the plasma field involves an interaction with 5 other fields in this simple setup. And the net result is that the magnetical field will emit from the North Pole and come back into the South Pole, and in some way has to move. And concurrently, because of the interaction between the magnetical field and the gravitational field, the entire plasma field has to rotate in its singularity. So is the rotating field exclusively a singular transaction zone? And is the magnetical field exclusively a duality transaction zone? In the simple form, you could say yes. But this universe is interdependent. So at what point do you restrict your field of influence? And can you exclude yourself from the universe so that you could isolate and say, these are the only transaction zones that I will accept, and I will not accept anymore? Can you do that in an interdependent universe? Well, I think not. And that's the whole point. Because energy is actually always in motion. So it's always positive. But the charge has to do with the magnetical emission and the gravitational absorption. And so this affects, as we said, the rotation, the speed, the strength, and the direction of the flow. And so somehow, some way, it's going from the magnetical emission to the gravitational absorption. And so it has to do this pole flipping to be able to move. So the transaction zone becomes important for motion. So it's not just to capture the energy in motion in a field, but you have to capture the energy coming in and you have to facilitate the energy going out. And the two have to go together, just as we did in the terracing with the gradient falling. So this transaction zone becomes this gravitational falling binding point, and it's an arbitrary point of view because we're not taking into account the other loose ends. They appear to be just terminal ends, but they're not. They're connected to other things. And what do you take into account? How many do you take into account? How big is large? What are, what are your binding points? So when we look at the core inertia points, we have to understand that there's a relationship because there's a manifestation of points of view. There are 2 points of view. One is gravitational and magnetical, and the other is magnetical gravitational. And so this transaction zone is that gravitational inertia point. That's the basic part of the transaction zone. And when you have these star inertia gradients, you see that they are susceptible to increase or decrease. So this transaction zone is only a product of what you're looking at. That becomes the gravitational inertia point, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. So this whole concept of duality is that you have to have these 2 points connected by a transaction zone. They work in tandem as a partnership. So it's all part of the fundamental twinity. And you can do this not only through nearness and proximity, but through field strength. And that would be the basis of the common denominator. It does not have to be the lowest common denominator. That's the point. So when we're looking at how ray motion is created, there's natural creation and natural decay. And that's the one area that we see. We say, if we see it, we believe it. But that is the product of a transaction zone, which is also part of a natural creation and a natural decay, which we can't see. So the transaction zone becomes that boundary and that bonding area. And if we can't determine it, then we just fudge it and say, well, yeah, it's there. We kind of accept it, but did you ever wonder why when you come into a building and the caretaker puts a slippery when wet sign, and so they've mopped the floor and They don't want you to slip in the water on, because it's still drying. And yet, when you look at a football quarterback, he licks his fingers before he gets the ball so that he can be more sticky. How can water make it more slippery and water make it more sticky? So this concept of the twinity, we started with 2 points of the nanotech, and we've seen the 2 points of the picotech, and then the 2 points of the star tech. So these are the beginnings of our understanding the twinity of the nanotech and the twinity of the GANS tech. They operate by the same rules. So the connection, the bonding zone is that transaction zone. And so whatever you get from the interaction of these two fields is what is called that transaction, the exchange of energy. And when you have different polyatomic inertia gradients, and then you start to connect multiple points together. And so each one has a transaction zone, which is either gravitational or either magnetical in relationship to each other. And then you can create a growth. And that growth is a kind of motion. So you have one, then you have two, then you have three, or you have one and it moves to another point. So growth and motion are the same thing. They are a manifestation of the transaction zone, and the transaction zone then becomes part of what we call these dynamic plasma relationships. So you have this horizontal transmission, and we say you have this vertical transition, and that creates a transaction zone in the core. But you have this energy that is going around as a satellite, and the movement from one point to another point is a transaction zone. And that only affects 2 points, but there are multiple points. And so each movement of each point is a transaction zone. So now you've created a flow. And so this is the Earth space field, and the Earth space point is within that field. And so that creates that relationship. So if we understand the creation of free plasma, then we look at the star formation, the coming together of the hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon. That is a transaction zone. And if you look at another amino acid, that is another transaction zone. And so when these amino acids attract each other through this common denominator, that becomes a gravitational transaction zone. And so these are the building blocks of life. And you see that it's a structure within a structure. And they all have this magnetical gravitational relationship. So when we're looking at the carbon inertia highways and we see the relationship between the various fields, we have to understand that there is a complementary field in the background. And then when we look at fields in the background, then we see that, well, there's a complementary field in that background. So these are all multiple relationships and multiple transaction zones. And it shouldn't be a surprise when we see in the 603rd Knowledge Seekers Workshop this vertical alignment in terms of our relationship between the soul of physicality, and the physicality. So there's a vertical alignment between the soul and the physicality. And there's a horizontal alignment with the soul of physicality. And there's a connection. And the connection follows circular paths. It's not just a straight line from here to there. And if it goes in one direction, it has to have a complementary movement in another direction. So it has a complete circuit. And so we see that, and this is where we get this yin-yang, this infinity loop. So we see the one energy interaction between the soul and solar physicality in the upper portion, and the solar physicality and the physicality in the lower portion, and then understanding the connection between the physicality and the soul is another infinity loop. And so these all become transaction zones, transactions of energy. But there's another way to do that, and that's through the emission. And so that allows us to have an inertia field emission. And this allows us to have a capability of threshold crossing from one energy level to another energy level without losing the confinement of the field, without being destroyed, without being consumed. So we see that GANS flows in water, and water itself can exchange energy. So water can give and take. GANS can give and take. And so there's a magnetical energy and a gravitational energy, and the GANS facilitates that exchange. So this is important because we are bags of GANS, and we are a large portion, over 75% water. And the water that we have within us is a plasma water. And the GANS that we have within us is a plasmatic energy state. And the two interact and give and take. So they follow different MAGRAV pathways based on the gravitational intensity, which we call the feedback part of attraction, and the magnetical outintensity of what we call the feeding impact of repulsion. So the electron is the giver, and the neutron is the taker. So I'm sure you can see the difference between the two. So when we look at this peace dome reactor, it can do many things based on its relationship. One, it can be a dimension point we call shielding, or it can be a dimension point we call a star positioning, or it can be a dimension point which we call possession, which is based on our physicality. So there are all these possibilities, and they're determined by our attention. So as we see, part of the community is the unity, and our unity is with our inner space. And so our inner space becomes a transaction zone, because that facilitates this mental and physical bonding. The bonding is a zone. The soul and consciousness bonding, another zone. And the energy and intention bonding, that's another zone. So what do you give your time and attention to? And time and attention is going to be a major topic of discussion. Because when we look at the undifferentiated beginning, we see, well, the neutron came before the atom in the PM tick. And then the PM tick was an energy transaction zone. But the atom itself is a product of that transaction, and it came from the darkness within because it now manifests into light. So the principal matter is magnetical, and it's ubiquitous in the universe. And the coming together and convergence of all of these PM ticks, they create this antimatter field, dark matter field, and matter gen field. And the combination of those three come together as a plasmagen conversion. And it doesn't manifest in its physicality until it has a place to do that. And for us, it's Earth. And so our physical emergence is between the plasmagen conversion and the Earth space inertia field. And so our physicality is a gravitational maggrav created by the interaction of these two fields. And so we are that transaction zone where the plasma fields originally come together and each one has a relationship so that one is magnetical and one is gravitational. And they create this point in between where we have this manifestation. And so at this point, we're discussing the GANS. So the GANS is at that transaction point. And we did that when we made the cups of life. So this is how we have this gravitational conformation of oxygen, because oxygen emits light in an emission spectrum. So it's crossing the threshold of going from that plasma state to that physical state. But oxygen itself is a non-visible gas. But it has a fingerprint which we can track. So this is all part of the matter-plasma dimensions. And we are in the process of retiring our understanding of the matter-plasma because we have achieved an expertise in the field of understanding physical science because we can touch it and we can see it. And we become overly dependent on that. And we totally ignore the plasmatic field because we can't touch it and can't see it. But it is still part of the matter-plasma dimension because it's a contributor to the transaction zones between the physicality and the plasma state. And so we are feedback dominant in terms of our point of view. And we're totally ignorant of the feeding. And that's actually a bit rude, but that is the way our society is working. And so we have an awakening that's going on across our humanity, where we are now coming to grasp this plasma matter dilemma, where we understand that the atomic state, nanostate, and GANS state are part of the physicality, and the plasma state is part of the plasma reality, but it too is a contributor to the maggrav energy transfer states that constitute part of the laws of conservation. So the molecular matter shows a communication link between masses, and that those masses are together through a covalent bond, which is a manifestation based on the magnetical gravitational relationship of the poles. And that manifestation is a transaction zone. So what you transact is what you're going to get. Excuse me. So from the basic molecular matter, we get into the atomic matter. There's still a bond between two masses. But now we see a splitting up from the neutron into the atomic state. And that is something we refer to as radiation. And it seems to be very attractive as an energy source. And maybe now we have some competition in that regard. So when we're looking at the threshold of matter, we have to understand that there's a singularity of each field, but there's a duality of the maggrav of the inertia field. So the transaction zone becomes the convergence of a certain point in the matter antimatter, and dark matter. And whatever that is, that's the threshold of the matter. And that will be the determination of its susceptibility. So the dimensions of the star formation are different points of view of each Magrav's singularity. So the soul point of view and the solar physicality point of view is creating this threshold of awareness. And when we cross that, we get this physical interpretation. And as most of us come to understand that it's the energy coming from the higher to the lower, then we end up with this collective point of awareness. And that manifests into a totally different type of star formation. And so we are on the verge of a unbelievable new technology. So we don't have to have and be neighbors. We are knowing by connection, because there's a contiguous connection throughout the universe, which adopts these feeding and feedback principles, but they're governed by truthfulness, fundamental truthfulness. That's the only way. So what are we looking for? To answer questions that we've had for generations. And we can understand our generational point of view through our parents and grandparents. And we have artificial intelligence, which can give us rapid generational learning. So our learning is not just, from our birth to our death, but we can have a rapid historical generational learning. But we are on the threshold of a transgenerational awareness beyond our immediate generation and connect to the teachings of the Creator. So one of the things that life is teaching us is how things work. But in reality, it's actually teaching us how things don't work, because too many of us are making too many mistakes. And so there's a reluctance to do things, because for each thing that you do is an opportunity to make a mistake. Well, that creates a paralysis. And the Creator creates motion, creates life. So don't worry about that. Making mistakes. Mistakes only teach you how to do things better. Learn from your mistakes and be confident in going forward, because we are dependent on supplementation that's due to consumption. But we now have an acquired knowledge, which has exposed the conditional teaching by ancient teachers and shown the difference between the unconditional teaching by the Creator. And this is the 20% deficiency that we have. So we have a new awareness that is establishing this historical threshold between cosmic feeding and loose harvesting. And that's the cross which humanity has to carry as a burden, because there's an interaction between the soul and the physicality in its vertical alignment, and the solar physicality in its horizontal alignment. We are crossing this threshold, and we're coming up with new results. And so we see in the 609th Knowledge Seeker Workshop how we're abandoning that overcompensation of our physicality and starting to enlist the services of our soul awareness. And it is becoming even more dynamic, because we're seeing the fingerprint of the amino acids of life in other forms. And so we're headed into uncharted territory, maybe, because we are the herd at the turning point. There are many stars beyond this nanomonatomic state, and they all cover a different range from decay to radiation. And so the AI is the ancestral intelligence, where we are that technology and we are the inertia product. We are the image of our dimensional convergence point. But that point is the transaction zone of what we've created. And so we can create another humanity inertia GANS shielding point to shield us from hostiles, from aggression, from environmental harm, and from fear mongering, from emotional abuse, because they cause us to be leakers. And so it's hard for us to cross that memory threshold because we're at that tipping point where we don't have that seriously long-term memory. So the freedom connects you to memory. And there's a lifelong memory, but there's a historical memory that's beyond our lifespan. And there's an ancestral memory, which is beyond our immediate history, through beyond our grandparents and great grandparents. But there's also a universal memory, which goes right back to the universal order of creation. And so our ability to transition through these various energy states has a speed, a strength, and it's a way for us to transfer energy. So energy is portable. We can go from physical matter state to energy state. That's part of elevation. We can go from energy state to physical matter state. We do that very well, and that's part of inertia. So the elevation involves expansion, just like the GANS popcorn. So our understanding takes more into account. And so we can have these transaction zones with more. So we can be more and do more and be more effective. And so we are connecting better to this dynamic soul initiator, which comes from the soul of the creator and the interaction with the soul of the earth and the soul of the family of the humanity that's representative of each individual soul of the man, soul of the body, and soul of the cells. These are all part of the epitome of life. So all we have to understand is how to tune into the cosmic rays. It sounds simple, but it's the soul food that allows us to plug into the creator and receive the energy, turn on to its incoming flow, and drop out of the resistance and the fear and pick up that inertia point. How we do this is determined by how we provide the pattern. Our success in doing that is the success in how we get that energy. And the better the pattern, the more energy we get. And isn't that what we want? To contribute to that greater oneness. For 612 weeks, we brought the Knowledge Seekers workshops together. So we're at the point where we can suddenly transcend the limitations of nuclear science, which involves radiation with a negative context. But we are all nuclear. We are all dynamic. We're all very plasmatic. And we all have a great capability of contributing to the transaction zones. We're at the point where we can take the diamonds we create with the nanostate and manifest them to gold in mass quantities. And we do this with the transmutation of GANS because it has an affinity of truth that happened May the 10th of 2025. That is this year. We have this imminent technology release because our beds are burning and the time has come to achieve a scientific rescue, transcends into a financial, political, and neuropreservation rescue, to understand that we are seeking a consumption rescue, a creation rescue. It's all part of the knowledge, and we have that knowledge, and we're practicing with the transmutation test. The next test is coming up very shortly, and you can all be part of that. Well, you are automatically part of that anyway, because our mission is to bring peace on earth and join humanity with the universal community. Oh, is that a fact? We want to bring man as equal to all the beings in the universe. by teaching the plasma science and technology equally to everyone, that no one is left out and no one is abused due to the lack of knowledge. So the one planet, one nation, one race event is all navigating around the World Peace Treaty, because that's our treaty. That's our understanding of the Kesh Foundation Spaceship Institute's teaching on plasma science. We're welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers of this carbon nation, learning about the new selection process of the new organic plasma science. That World Peace Treaty is something you have to choose and mean it unconditionally, sign it sincerely. The point of the true GANS text is to cross these polyatomic boundaries. The peace dome of outer space can be your guiding beacon. And is the inertia of the present governed by the dimensions of history? Well, it all depends on how you apply it. It's time to learn the history of self in a universal context. That GANS is a peaceful superconductor of true intentions. That transaction zone uses the GANS tech for matter state, plasma state, and universal state. So let's keep the plasma science being delivered daily via the Peace Dome in a practical exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new golden outer space age. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the trip.
Okay, thank you, Alex. That's quite a bit to put under our hat. Again, many interesting concepts there, but it's for us to investigate and understand more. And thank you for providing this channel of teaching in a way. I had to think of you yesterday. Mr. Kesh was, I think there was a question number 3 about how does this 3i create gravity? And of course, Mr. Kesh said it's different than the way we've been taught. And it uses this field structure and not a matter structure. And then he referenced what you've often referenced about the acid and alkaline, how it's the same process, he said, as when this acid flips to alkaline or the alkaline flips to acid by the energy of itself, he said. So I was thinking of you. And then he said, by changing the position of the fields plus the environment of both, in this interaction, he said, they create a black hole. He said, we can do this, but we don't teach it. So thank you for teaching it, Alex. Mr. Kesh was saying they don't teach it. He said it's like the way the planets are made. This interaction of the fields is not a dynamic system. He said he called it a static system. So the fields inside, I guess they don't create a rotation in a way, or not by rotating spheres. I guess he called it a static system. But anyway, I had to think of you. And then, of course, you've been mentioning the GANs. And of course, it's been disappointing to hear that that material is still waiting to be recognized by the scientific community as a new, in a way, matter state, even though it's not so new, but it would be new to have the scientific community start to recognize this. But thank you for your presentation, and let's see if the participants have generated any sort of questions or something they'd like to ask you or just share with us what they've understood. When you use these terms, the duality of inertia of the MAGRAV fields, it's almost, I was thinking, when I first heard the antimatter of the plasma, and I'm thinking to myself, well, I don't know what antimatter is, and I don't know what a plasma is. This is in the beginning of all these teachings. So yes, we're learning more and more. I'm not still fully sure I know everything about it. I'm sure I don't, but we're learning more step by step. So does anyone have a question or something they'd like to share about what Alex has shared with us? Well, anything you'd like to review, Alex?
I just spent an hour reviewing it. Uh, I think we have to understand that there's more than what meets the eye, and we have to have the confidence in that. Okay, this is really, really important because it allows us to navigate. Fundamentally, life is very hard, and most of us choose to make it harder. Let's say through drug addiction or alcoholism or something like that, or just making bad decisions. And if we were to understand that our um, physicality is based on our true intentions, then we have to admit the fundamental thing is that we can't lie to ourselves because we know we're lying. So, who are you fooling? But we do see that, and sometimes we scratch our heads and say, well, you talk a good game, but you don't do it. And where do we see that most often? At New Year's Eve parties. Yeah, I'm going to quit smoking, but after the party. And I look at when I quit smoking, and it was before the party, and people were looking at me strangely and said, like, you're not supposed to quit smoking before the party. You have to, inhale a full deck of cigarettes before you quit. And I thought, well, at some point in time, if I quit after the party, next year there'll be another party. And so would you say that I quit before the party? And or would I then say, I have an excuse, New Year's Eve party, I can smoke, and then I'll quit again after. Well, you're just fooling yourself in all regards. And I mean, we're all guilty of it. And one of the reasons for that is because, you know, when we had the parents telling us what to do, we did it grudgingly, right? Or when they turned their backs, we just went and did what we wanted to do, and we discovered ourselves whether we're right or whether we're wrong. So it just stands to reason that when your parents tell you what to do, they don't necessarily have the only correct answer. It's an answer from their point of view, and you assume that they have your best interests at heart. But the truth is that no one has your best interest at heart more than you do. And this is where we have to take comprehensive responsibility. And we don't want to do that. We'd rather pass it off because wouldn't it be better if someone else was to carry that as a burden? So what we have to understand is that a responsibility is not a burden, but it's welcome because it allows you to bring peace and prosperity into your life. And for some people, losing the opportunity to blame someone else for your failures is stressful. And I'm not really sure where that comes from, except that what I do see is that we are constantly reinforced with that notion. And, we succumb to it. So you need to have a strong constitution, to do it your way. And it's hard, especially when 100 people are yelling at you, this is the way you do it. And you say, well, yeah, but we've been doing it that way all the time and it's not working. So we have to change. And they say, well, that's the way we always do it. And it's always worked. It just doesn't work when you do it. Well, something's missing. And that's what we have to be truthful about. And that part is so hard for most of us. And the one thing that I like about the Kesh Foundation is that it is all promoting hopefulness, because it allows us to be empowered to chart our own path and not be restricted to some density or destiny, density and destiny that is laid out by someone else, in their own, shall we say, mind's eye. Each of us has a mind's eye as to how things should operate, and life is for learning. And so every time we make a mistake, it guides us. I'm going to leave it at that, Mark. Back to you.
Okay, anyone would like to join the conversation? And we will listen to this more, this open discussion that was had. But very interesting, he mentioned about the breast milk and everything, and how the mother knows or the breast knows. Somehow there's a communication between the child and the mother, and the breast doesn't always provide the same energies. It seems to understand what the child needs at that certain point. And this builds up a connection, but it also, this plasmatic system. And that's what I thought he said. As you play the game, somehow these cosmic rays will see where you're short. It's almost like a measuring device, and add what sort of maybe over time or gradually what you're missing in that understanding, perhaps. Again, this is beyond the teaching with the whiteboard and the blackboard and the rest of it. Using our vocal cords, there's some sort of plasmatic interaction that's going to start to take place, I think, more and more, rather than each one teach one type of thing. And he was saying this happens between the time of feeding with the child and the rest of this. The child needs vitamin A or vitamin D. Somehow the mother knows that and feeds that through the breast of the child. So it's just amazing that this will be taken into a much more, I guess, comprehension of all of us. This is part of the enlightenment. I think we're going to all drift more towards the energy understanding, although some may not. They stick to the matter state of things. But so many beautiful things are going to happen in the coming period. As he said, look for that announcement from Mark Ray. But he did say it won't be a big bang next week or the week after that. But it's part of a process that will be started. So it's amazing how everything has been put together so precisely, in a way, even though it still is jumbled in our minds, kind of how this whole thing is coming together, but it is. And again, when you carry this sort of understanding as a universal teacher, it all looks amazing to us, but this has been done before in the experience of Mr. Kesh over millions of years of bringing civilizations into the bigger family. This is all part of it. One of the questions I was asking earlier, Alex, is in another meeting, maybe I asked it here, was this group, were they aware that where they were planting the seeds millions of years ago, that perhaps, as Mr. Kesh said, we were seeded this way, did they realize that the universe was not providing the total amount of energies needed, and this creation would grow and go out into the universe and carry that sort of killing streak with it? And he said everything was calculated on their trip and the rest. Or is this the way you work in the universe? Perhaps your first creation may not have been perfect and you come back and perfect it or add energies to it. He said it's in this part of the universe. So I was just wondering if they calculated that out. Obviously not, but I wonder why they're sort of planting in a place that would leave the soul indented. But maybe that's part of the bigger work of them creating newer versions or adding to what that creation that they started needed. And perhaps this is the time for that. Just a thought I had. Why would you plant and create? I mean, could we call it genetically modified? Not on their end, but because the universe didn't provide the energies needed to keep the soul or the physicality from doing funny things to get the energy that it needs. Just wondering about that. Anybody want to make a comment?
You see, that's a very important question. The it has always been confounding to me to understand why someone would strive to actually be in a worse shape than before. And the measure that was given to me is a basic question. Is the world a better place today for me having been here? And just take the time frame between the morning and the evening. And if the answer is no, then you have other questions to ask. But if the answer is yes, then that's a clear indication that you are on the right path. The stress comes in is when you start to be competitive about it. And I grew up in a very competitive environment, and what's been very hard for me has been to minimize my competitiveness in that regard. And I'm starting to see success in that basis. The real turning point for me was when I understood this business about lying, because I had the personal dilemma when I knew that someone was lying, and I would almost, automatically want to blurt out and say, "Well, no, 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 you're lying," but that would create conflict. And whether you want conflict or you don't want conflict, you have to look at what are the consequences of that conflict, and what do you hope to achieve. And you can ask that question into a lot of conversations. Uh, you have people who ask you a casual question, and so you wonder, like, why are you asking that question? Are you being nosy? Are you interfering? Or are you just having a friendly chat? And but there's some people who practice that as a way to, shall we say, try and appear in a more dominant stance. For them, it's always a competition. They have to always do things bigger and better than you. And there's no other better way to describe it than the American notion of keeping up with the Joneses. They have a new car, you need a new car. They have a riding lawnmower, you need a light riding lawnmower, and it needs to be bigger and more powerful. And so it becomes a competition of acquisition. And for what? For what purpose? So for bragging rights, what does it mean to have bragging rights? Is it for show? How many people buy a new car to demonstrate that they have acquired something, better than others, to show off, if you will? Meanwhile, they can't make the payments, and they're burdened with anxiety. What does that achieve? it's not what I would consider a noble aspiration. But if you're looking at, let's say, a sporting event, your team is playing and you want to go down there and support your team, whether they win or lose becomes very important to you. Well, in the context of the league standings or that particular competition, or whether it's a so-called rivalry. But what about in the game of life? You know, I was doing a show once, and a gentleman I knew had terminal cancer, and he was coming into my booth to look at the products I was selling. And I knew that he didn't have long to live, and none of the products that I had anything to do with extending his longevity. And I wasn't about to give him credit. So, I said, well, what's the point in discussing it? And is this what you do when you're counting your final days? And then in your final days, you say, well, I wish I had another day. Well, do you wish you had another day like the previous day when you were suffering? Or do you wish to have another day like when you were 20 years old, full of vinegar and energy and vitality? Is that the kind of day that you wish? Well, why do you wish that on your deathbed? Why don't you wish that all along? And so, what can you do to improve your, shall we say, lot in life? And what is your lot in life? And then we now come with the notion that some people do have a shorter life expectancy because that was the arrangement, that was the deal that they made, that was the promise that they made to their soul. And when that promise was fulfilled, they completed their journey, they completed their mission. So would you attribute that to their faults, failings, and weaknesses? Or would you say that's mission accomplished? Or would you say that they made a deal and they fulfilled it and they were a contributor to the well-being of this planet? So we all have these choices, and then we can all measure them in our own way, but we don't measure them the same way because we all have the free will to do that. So when we have the free will obstructed, that's abuse. And why would you want to obstruct the free will of someone else? So in other words, if I know how to do something better and I tell you how to do something better, my goal is to improve your activity. But if you don't take it, if you don't take the advice, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to get upset? Am I supposed to get angry? Am I supposed to take you out into the alley and beat some sense into you? It's your choice. My choice is to give it. Your choice is to take it. If you don't want to take it, I fulfilled my choice. So in essence, and I've mentioned this before, my teaching these classes, I learn a lot more from it than you do because I have to prepare these classes. I have to believe that I know what I'm talking about. And so it puts a stress. It isn't just casual learning. And then from there, there's a progression. And frankly, it's become easier and easier. And as Mr. Kess said last week, we've pretty well come to the end of the teaching. What we really have to do is improve the quality of our understanding. Well, there's the guidepost. That tells you where we're going from here. And that's why we're discussing the GANS tech in a different context. So we have to understand that all energy is exchanged as a transaction. So in our society, money is the currency. In our health, adenosine triphosphate is the currency. But in the universe, the cosmic rays are the currency. So if we understand this and bring it within our sphere of understanding and awareness and practical application, there is no question that we will bring peace and prosperity to this planet because it's automatic. When you surround yourself with peace-loving people, then it becomes peaceful. But if you surround yourself with warmongers, then you're just breeding a hateful environment because you need to have an excuse for being at war, don't you? Back to you, Mark.
Right, and you've always mentioned about this lying. Mr. Kesh said this is the biggest sin till about 200 years ago in Iran was to lie. And that's what we're going to close out with, that little clip about this thinking, speaking, and acting good is the cornerstone of life here and anywhere in the universe, apparently, but only you can apply it, right?
Exactly. Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks for everybody for allowing me to continue to make these presentations. I hope you're enjoying them, and I hope you make good use of them. And remember, you have to do it your way and within your capability and your understanding. But please continue teaching because the rest of the humanity is desperately wanting to know. Back to you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Anyone else want to bring up a point or ask a question? Ed is prepared, and we put it in the chat. He's edited out the Chinese and the Portuguese out of that open discussion, so you can find that in the American Knowledge Team and other locations in the Keshe Foundation. Raphael said, "Thank you for your work, Ed." But more exciting things as the days and the weeks progress. Again, it's quite a bit in the hand of the Keshe Foundation, and hopefully some of the others will start to join. We'll see how this everything sort of shakes out with this other group coming in and so on. Did you like the word pirated? He said we're being pirated. I guess they're spreading their life in this solar system, and there's not much we can do about it. But he did use the word pirate, and normally that doesn't have a good connotation. But these are probably the good pirates to bring us gifts of enlightenment and peace and so on for this planet. Anyone else? All right, we're going to try and I'm going to take the screen if there's no other interactions. Let's see here. I'm going to just switch this over and then we'll continue here. Oops, and that little part about the ethos of Mitra being the cornerstone of life here and anywhere in the universe is around, it comes up in a question which Mr. Kesh answers at this point, which we'll play, but let's just show. And again, I always thought the three wise men had some sort of deeper meaning. Well, we know as we read in the holy books, the gifts to the child from the three wise men were not the gold, the incense, and the precious oils. That's all matter state gifts, but the gifts were the speaking, thinking, and acting good, which you can apply. And it creates, as he said, the three I is creating a repulsive atmosphere around itself. In other words, any incoming things will get handled. And I think works the same way with your thinking, speaking, and acting. Again, we're not perfect. We're not robots. We fall. We need strength in certain areas, but we're moving closer and closer in perfecting this dimension of thinking, speaking, and acting good. And then, of course, you can be proud of the work you do. You can be proud of the person you are, and you can be proud of the difference you make. We're all making a difference, whether you're teaching or you're not. But it is beautiful to hear you say, Alex, we're all students and we're all teachers at the same time. Just sharing what we think we understand about this knowledge, and I think our eyes are being more and more open. So the gift of the three wise men, again, something that only in a way you can practice, but I think the energies coming on this planet will make that process, as well as feeding and transmutation and so many of the other things, much easier to attain, perhaps. This is what I think. Again, it's a gift from the Creator, as I understand it, because all the created beings in the universe will have that ability to transit between the dimension of energy and the dimension of matter state, which never existed before. And as Mr. Kesh said, we're much closer than anyone could imagine, even those in the universal community. So apply the three wise men and share it and create that sort of field of repulsion around you. Not that you're repulsed by the others, but any of the things you're interacting with will not have that tugging or whatever, or pulling in the wrong direction of your emotions. And it's not an easy balance. The sun is doing it constantly, moving millions of miles to keep the entire solar system in balance in a way. So this is like a never ending process, but it does get easier as you recognize energies that come in that could upset you or do other things to you, that you can balance them out or again shield yourself from them. But it's up to you to apply that.